Hey, welcome to Restoration. My name is Matt. So glad you could join us on this Shabbat or whatever day you are watching this message. We are in our series on the scroll of Genesis, and we're spending a year going through the Torah, the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, along with the Torah and Haftorah cycle. And it's foundational to understand the God of Israel and his heart to bring all of creation back to himself. Now, last week, we talked about how Jacob saw the Lord on the steps of the stairway to heaven, and God made all the same promises to Jacob as he made to Abraham and Isaac, and where they believed God, Jacob made his response conditional. If you go with me in the way I'm going, then you will be my God. And the language we use among people who read the Bible and talk about the Bible, the language we use is Jacob wrestled with God and that the wrestling was good, like we should wrestle with God. And here's the revelation that I had as I worked on this passage and message. We are not wrestling God. We are wrestling with fear. And God is trying to get us to stop wrestling and instead put our trust in the outcomes that are only his responsibility. So then what is our responsibility? Well, our responsibility is to be faithful to the things we know while waiting for God to do what only he can do. And so we actually aren't supposed to wrestle with God. When we wrestle with fear, we refuse to stop wrestling. When we wrestle with fear, we have to stop wrestling with fear. And that's when we refuse to stop wrestling with fear. That's when the Lord shows up to wrestle us. Because God's only option when we won't let go of fear is to punch us in the groin, to injure us. Not punitively, but to force us to let go of fear and trust in him. Now, being scared and fearing the Lord are two different things. So John Bevere says it this way: someone who's scared of God has something to hide. The person who fears God has nothing to hide. Or Stephen Furtick said, while you're waiting for God to change your situation, he's changing you. But we resist that change with all of our might. So we fight and we stress and we imagine all of the ways it could go wrong. And we try to protect ourselves by scheming and planning and working out solutions that answer the fears that we have, not realizing that we can't base our plans on our fears. This is Jacob's problem in the text. He's lived a life of scheming, deceiving, and manipulation based on his fears that maybe God won't bless him, but God already promised to bless him and his seed. So since last week's message, Jacob has now spent 20 years in Padan Aram. He's gone up from Bethesda to Bethel, where he saw the Lord in the dream on the stairways. Then he spends 20 years in Padan Aram. And for 20 years, he continues deceiving and is actually deceived himself in the process of marriage. Wanting to marry the younger daughter of his uncle Laban, he's tricked into marrying the older daughter. And then he has 2 wives and their 2 concubines, and they have 11 sons and 1 daughter. And there's a rivalry between the wives, between brothers and between sons. And there's hyperlinks to everyone who has come before and hyperlinks to all those who will come after in the future. But Jacob went his own way for 20 years, and he kept doing all the wrong things. And 20 years from when God shows up to him in a dream, now God is about to show up in real life. The Lord will wrestle Jacob because Jacob won't stop wrestling with fear. And Jacob finally begins to head back to Canaan, and he leaves after his 20 years. But when he escaped from his brother Esau, who wanted to kill him, and he ends up in a place called Mahanaim. He goes from Haran to Mahanaim, and it's there that Mahanaim is called 2 camps, is what it means. And then he goes to Peniel, which is God's face. And then he ends up in Sukkot, which means tabernacle, because they all have to do with the presence of the Lord, before he finds himself back where he's supposed to be. So at the end of last week's portion, Torah portion, is chapter 32 and verse 2. It says, while Jacob left on his way, the angels of God met him. And the word for angels here is the word for messenger. And in fact, it's the same Hebrew word that's used in the next few verses. It says, then Jacob said, when he saw them, the angels, this is God's camp. And he named the place Mahanaim. Now, first, that place we talked about last week is the same word at Bethel. It's a sacred site. So that place is actually a sacred site because remember, in the ancient Near East, sacred sites are places you stop because there's a well for water and it's on a hill and it's a place where heaven meets earth. And he calls it the place of two camps, which is what Mahanaim means, which later this city becomes the city of the Levites and the priesthood, and his camp is in the same place. It's a hyperlink back to Eden, where God and humanity shared the same space together, where heaven and earth meet. Now there's two camps, one with angels from God and Jacob's camp. Remember, 20 years earlier, he saw angels in a dream when he saw the Lord on the stairway to heaven and the angels going up and down. Now he's seeing them in real life, and he's sharing space with them between heaven and earth. And heaven and earth are meeting in this place that he calls two camps. So this week's Torah portion starts in the next verse, in verse 4. And it says, then Jacob sent messengers, that's the same word as angels, but they're humans, before him to his brother Esau, to the land of Seir, which means hairy, and the field of Edom, which means red. And Jacob sent these two messengers, same Hebrew word, but this time they're not angels, they're humans. And there are two camps in the same place. There's Jacob's camp, and there's the Lord's camp. So Jacob sends two messengers from the camp to his brother Esau. It says in chapter 32 and verse 5, he commanded them, saying, this is what you should say to my lord, to Esau. This is what your servant Jacob said. I've been staying with Laban and have lingered until now. Now I've come to possess oxen, donkeys, flocks, male and servants and female servants, and I sent word to you to tell my lord in order to find favor in your eyes. And the messengers returned to Jacob. We went to your brother Esau, and he's coming out to meet you, and 400 men with him. So Jacob became extremely afraid and distressed, and he divided the people with him, along with the flocks and herds and camels, into two camps. So watch this. Out of fear, he divided his family into two camps in a sacred site that he called two camps. It's the place of two camps because angels are there, that's God's camp, and his camp, Jacob's family, and everything that has come with him from Haran. And out of fear, he separates his camp into two camps. He separates them in order of how much he loves the people. This is so messed up. Verse 9, it says, for he thought, well, if Esau comes to one camp and strikes it, then the camp that's left will escape. Okay, hold on. So let's split the camp into two, because if Esau kills some of my family, his 400 men kill one camp, maybe the other camp can escape. And so you have to remember that all the messengers said to Jacob was, he's bringing 400 men with him. Now, Jacob assumes in fear that Esau has an army and he's coming to kill him because of a grudge he's been holding on to for the last 20 years. So this spurs, for the first time in Jacob's narrative in Genesis, it spurs the first time that Jacob prays to God. And his prayer, it's a little frustrating. Then Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, Yud-He Vav-He, who said to me, return to your land and to your relatives, and I will do good for you. I am unworthy of all the proofs of mercy and all the dependability that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed over this Jordan, and now I've become two camps. Now I've become two camps. Did God tell him to split into two camps? Or did he decide to split his camp into two camps himself? And why did he come up with this idea? Because Jacob was extremely afraid and distressed. He acts out of fear because he's wrestling with fear of death at the hands of his brother, which is why he was exiled 20 years ago. So his prayer continues in verse 12. Deliver me, please, from my brother's hand, from Esau's hand, for I am afraid of him, that he'll come and strike me. the mothers with the children. And you yourself said, I will most certainly do good with you and will make your seed like the sand of the sea that cannot be counted because of its abundance. So Jacob's saying, you told me, Lord, to return to the land of my family, and you said everything would be good. So now here I am. I'm coming back 20 years later, and the same fear that drove me to Padan Aram in the first place is flooding back as I return. And now Esau's coming with 400 men, and he's going to kill me. And what am I going to do? In the words of Master Yoda, fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. I sense much fear in you. Chapter 32, verse 23, it says, then he got up that night and he took his 2 wives and his 2 female servants and his 11 sons, and he crossed over the ford of the Yabok. Now, these 3 words I put in Hebrew here because you need to know that these 3 words have the same letters as Jacob's name. In fact, there's a total of 7 words within these 10 verses that are reordering of the letters of Jacob's name. In verse 25, it says, so Jacob remained all by himself. Then he wrestled. That's another form of Jacob's name. With him until the break of dawn. And when he saw that he had not overcome, he struck the socket of his hip. So he dislocated the socket of Jacob's hip when he wrestled with him. All versions of Jacob's name. Then he said, let me go, for the dawn has broken. But he said, I won't let you go until you bless me. And then he said, what is your name? Jacob, Yaakov, he answered. And then he said, you will no longer be Jacob, Yaakov, but rather Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men, and you have overcome. Listen, in all of these references to Jacob's name, 7 times, including Jacob's name and the word name 3 times, the author's making the point that this section is all about Jacob's name. The word name is even in there. Jacob's identity for his whole life has been wrapped in the idea that he grabs at the heel, that he's a deceiver and a trickster, and that's why he's in trouble. That's why he's in the trouble he's now. He tricked his brother 20 years ago and escaped before he could be killed by his brother, which is a hyperlink to Cain and Abel earlier in Genesis. And he goes from 2 camps, the Lord's camp and his camp, and he crosses, which is just like his name, a river, which sounds just like his name, and then he ends up alone in a place that he's going to call God's face. And 20 years ago, he saw God in a dream. Now, the Lord is going to show up in person, but in somewhat of a disguise. Because it says in verse 25, so Jacob was by himself, and then a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn, which just makes me want to sing a Michael Jackson song. But a man shows up. That's an ish in Hebrew. That's what Adam is called in Genesis chapter 2. A man, an ish. And what does God say about the ish in Genesis chapter 2? Remember 7 times in Genesis 1, it says God keeps saying everything is tov, everything is good. And then the last of the 7 times, he looks at creation and he says, it's very good. And then in Genesis 2, verse 18, he says, it is not good for a man to be alone. Same words in Hebrew, alone and man. So Jacob is alone by a river, and this man shows up. And what's the next logical thing to happen? Of course, they don't talk to each other and they wrestle. This is so weird to us. And this is not weird in the ancient Near East. This all happens by a river, the river Yabok, which sounds just like Yaakov in Hebrew. And in the ancient Near East, there's numerous tales of river spirits in the ancient world who fight humans who are trying to cross a river. And if one could hold off through the night, the spirit would have been able to fight when the sun rises, when the sun comes up. And in some of the stories, if the person could injure the spirit, then they would let the victor pass. And so the elements of all these ancient Near East tales are right there in Genesis, but as Genesis does, it twists the narrative where the spirit doesn't seem to be a spirit at all, but it's an ish, a man, and this man also seems to be more than a man. So he injures Jacob because Jacob won't stop and the sun is coming up. So the man touches Jacob's thigh and disables him. In verse 26, it says, when he saw that he had not overcome, he struck the socket of his hip. So he dislocated the socket of Jacob's hip when he wrestled with him. Now, many translations say the word touched, and the TLV uses the word struck, as in hit or punched. And what did he punch? Well, the word translated socket can mean the palm of the hand. And the word for hip, yaroch, which is similar to Jacob's name, can mean the thigh, the loins, or the testicles, like the whole area of the groin. And in the ancient Near East, the thigh was understood as the seat of reproductive powers. And of course, the promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are all connected to the land and the seed of promise will inherit the land that God has promised. In other words, you could read it as, the man punched him in the groin. This could be a hyperlink back to Eliezer and Abraham when he put his hand under his thigh to commit to finding his son a wife, because it all has to do with the seed and the promise. And what does he do when he punches him in the groin? It says he dislocated the socket of Jacob's hip when he wrestled him. Well, the word in Hebrew for dislocated sounds just like Yaakov. It's Yakah. And it means to turn or to twist, to wrench or kill. So Jacob's thigh is pulled from his hip. And it may be that the man is crushing Jacob's testicles because his reproductive days are over. And the river, Yarbok, which sounds like Jacob's name, Yaakov, is the very entrance into the promised land from the wilderness before it belongs to Jacob's descendants. So in the days of Joshua, the 12 tribes are given each an inheritance in the land. And in the days of Joshua, Jacob, the land is promised, but here Jacob meets this man. He wrestles at what will be the boundary. This is so much fun for Bible nerds. Just, you can skip ahead if this isn't your jam, but it's so fun. The boundary of two of his descendants is the river Jabbok. It's the boundary between Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh. And this is really interesting because the story ends on this really weird note about not eating the tendon in the hip of animals. It says in verse 33, this is why the children of Israel do not eat the tendon of the hip socket, and to this very day, because he struck the socket of Jacob's thigh on the tendon of the hip. Well, in his commentary, Bill Arnold makes the point that twice the word tendon in Hebrew is the word for tendon is gid hanasheh. The names of Gad and Manasseh, the two tribes of Israel, are God Manasseh. So the very spot where Jacob's tendon is torn is the border between two of the 12 tribes of Israel that sound like tendon in his hip in Hebrew. Because the Hebrew Bible is amazing. And because the tendon is torn, Jacob limps as he crosses the river into the promised land from the wilderness. There's another connection to Genesis chapter 2, because it says, now the sun rose upon him just as he crossed, sounds like Jacob, by Peniel, limping because of his hip. The word for limping is actually the word solah, and it's related to the word for side, selah. In Genesis 2, when God split Adam and Eve, he did not take a rib, he cut Adam in half and took from his side. And here the word side is relating to his side that's not working correctly. Why? This is why he's walking funny. The side is connected to the creation of Ish and Isha, man and woman. And it's a man, an Ish, who injures Jacob by punching him in the groin, which is related to his children and the promise of seed and land. So, verse 27. Then he said, let me go, for the dawn has broken. But Jacob said, I won't let you go until you bless me. And the man said, what is your name? Yaakov, he said. Listen, Jacob's not wrestling with God. He's wrestling with fear. And this man injures Jacob because Jacob will not stop. He perseveres. He overcomes, it says. But this is not a good thing. Jacob doesn't get blessed because he won't stop. God was going to bless him anyway. He is fighting so hard for a blessing that God was already going to give him. He was not wrestling with God. He was wrestling with fear. And I think as the sun comes up, this man does not want to be recognized. The sun's coming up, and it will reveal his face. And it's the face that Jacob saw on a stairway to heaven in a dream. And now Jacob's about to see his face in real life. And he says, so what's your name? And he answers, Jacob. Oh, you mean like all the 7 words in those verses that point back to Jacob's name? And the man says to Jacob, your name will no longer be Yaakov, but rather Israel, for you have struggled with God and with man, and you have overcome. The word for struggle in the Hebrew is sha'ar, shara, and it is the same as Jacob's Sarah. It's the same as Jacob's grandmother's name, Sarah. And it has 2 meanings, to struggle and to rule. And here it's to struggle. And Sarah wrestled with fear, just like Jacob, and her name also means queen. And in this sense, in Genesis 35, in a few chapters, God changes Jacob's name again to Israel, but then it's with the promise that he will have kings that will come from his seed. This is all why Jacob gets hit, and why it hits Jacob, that's a pun intended, that this man seems more than just a man. Verse 30, then Jacob asked, and he said, please tell me, what's your name? Please tell me your name. And the man said, why are you asking my name? Then he blessed him there. And so Jacob named the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life has been spared. See, the man won't tell Jacob his name, but he blesses him there. And then Jacob gives the place, the name Peniel, the face of God. Now the word here is Elohim. It's not Yud-He-Vav-He. It's a generic name for God and could be used to describe lots of things from heaven. And at the same time, the man seems to be more than just that too. It's a bit of a riddle, and the riddle's on purpose. Because remember when Jacob dressed up like a deceiving snake to get the birthright and the blessing? Well, the man is an angel who is dressed like a man who is actually God. And for from Jacob's seed, God will bring Yeshua, who will come lower than the angels to crush the head of the serpent by offering himself for Israel, Jacob's descendants. We'll get to that later. Genesis 33 and verse 1. Then Jacob glanced up and saw, and behold, there was Esau coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided, this is even more specific, he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the 2 female servants. And this is so awful. He put the female servants and their children first, because they could die first. Then Leah and her children behind them. And then Rachel and Joseph in the order of how he loves them. He split his 2 camps into 3 groups, and he put them in the order of how much he loves them. Yikes. Because, if the first group gets killed, maybe the rest of us will survive. But then this is, I think, where Jacob becomes the leader and the patriarch he's supposed to be. Verse 3. He himself passed on ahead of them, and he bowed to the ground 7 times, and he came near to his brother. See, his plan was to go last. In case his brother killed everyone, maybe he could save himself and survive. But instead, after seeing the face of God, he goes first, believing that maybe he'll die. And of course, the funny thing is, Esau wasn't planning to kill him at all. They meet and they cry and they reconcile. And Esau doesn't want or need any gifts from Jacob. Esau forgives as God forgives. And this is why Jacob says in verse 10, it says, Jacob said, no, please, if you found favor in your eyes, then will you just take the offering from my hand? For this reason, I've seen your face. It is like seeing the face of God, and you've accepted me. But he just saw the face of God. in real life. But now his brother, who he's expecting to kill him, is acting like God and forgiving Jacob for stealing the blessing and the birthright 20 years before. This is why Jacob sees God's face in his brother's face. It's why Esau's face is like God's face. He thought Esau was going to kill him, but God wrenched his thigh instead. Then Esau forgave Jacob. Because remember, this whole thing started because Jacob was afraid. And his worst fear turned out to not even be true. I love how Tim Mackey says the Bible's plot conflict can be summarized as what happens when an irresistible force meets an immovable object. Jacob is the irresistible force, and God is the immovable object. God's will and human will are supposed to become one. They're two camps that are supposed to be one camp, like back to the Garden of Eden. And we are not wrestling with God. We're wrestling with fear. And God's trying to get you to stop wrestling and instead put your trust in the outcomes that are only his responsibility. So what is your responsibility? Your responsibility is to be faithful to the things you know while you wait for God to do what only he can do. The problem is Jacob's stubbornness wins, and he has to taste the consequences of what his stubbornness creates. This is going to be the whole narrative of Joseph that comes next. God tolerates and blesses a treacherous deceiver because of his promises, not because of what Jacob does or doesn't do. God concedes to Jacob's unwillingness to change, and he will not let Jacob's sin determine his overall purpose. So he blesses him anyway. And my friends, when you live in fear, you're always afraid. When you fear the Lord, you don't have to be scared of what may or may not happen. His promise is to be with you, to never leave you, no matter what happens. So for me and for you and for everyone, stop wrestling with fear. If you don't, God may show up and punch you in the groin. While you're waiting for God to change your situation, he is doing everything he can to change you. But we resist the change with all of our might. So we fight and we stress and we imagine all the ways it could go wrong. And then we try to protect ourselves by scheming and planning and working out solutions that answer the fears that we have, not realizing that you can't plan based on your fears. When we wrestle with God, when you wrestle with God, you cannot win. Your perseverance may win, but the consequence is going to be pain. And the consequence is pain in every step, so that every step you can remember not to struggle against God. It doesn't mean the pain lasts forever for every individual. Maybe just as long, the pain lasts just long enough to learn your lesson. And sometimes some of us just struggle with all kinds of pains because they're reminders of what we're supposed to do and who we're supposed to be. So don't struggle with God for blessing that he's already willing to give you. Don't be scared. Don't wrestle with fear anymore. Fear the Lord and trust that he will do what he promised and that he will never leave you or forsake you in the process. Lord God, we thank you for who you are and who you've called us to be as your people. And I pray, Lord, that you would help us to stop wrestling with fear and learn to fear the Lord, to fear you, to be in awe of you, to trust you in all the things that you are trying to help us understand, so that we can be the kind of people that you have called us to be. We love you, and we're so grateful for all that you've done for us. In Yeshua's name, amen. I love you guys, and I can't wait to see you when we continue the series with the narrative of Joseph and finish up the book of Genesis and then move into Exodus in not too long from now.